What happens when the spotlight shines too bright, too soon? In old Hollywood, child stars weren't just adored, they were owned. Behind their dazzling smiles were stories of exhaustion, manipulation, and lost innocence. From Judy Garland to Scotty Beckett, these young talents paid the price for fame. Stay with us as we uncover 23 heartbreaking tales of child stars exploited by the studio system. Judy Garland. Before she was even a teenager, Frances Gumm was remade into Judy Garland, a product of MGM's ruthless dream factory. She had a voice that could break hearts, but her real tragedy was how the studio broke her spirit. Signed at just 13, she was immediately told she was too chubby, too plain, too short. MGM placed her on amphetamines to stay thin and energized, and barbiturates to sleep, creating a drug dependency that would haunt her entire life. Behind the scenes of The Wizard of Oz, Judy was a child being prodded like cattle. Her meals were monitored, her corsets tightened, and her smiles were rehearsed. Executives told her she belonged to the public, not herself. She worked relentless hours with no room for innocence or rebellion. As she matured, the studio tightened its grip. Forced into loveless promotional relationships and denied control over her image, Judy's life spiraled under pressure. By the time she reached adulthood, her finances were in shambles, her mental health was unraveling, and the world still demanded more smiles. Her voice was immortal, but her story was one of slow erasure. She became an icon, but at a cost no child should ever be forced to pay. Judy Garland wasn't just exploited, she was consumed. Jackie Kugan. He was America's first true child star, earning millions in the silent era under Charlie Chaplin's wing. Jackie Kugan had it all: fame, adoration, and a face that lit up every marquee. But behind the scenes, the boy who brought joy to millions was being robbed blind by the very people who were supposed to protect him: his own mother and stepfather. After his father died, Jackie's earnings, reportedly over $4 million, were squandered on mansions, cars, and luxuries he never got to enjoy. When he turned 21 and asked for his money, his mother coldly declared, "No promises were ever made to give Jackie anything." Broke and betrayed, Kugan sued, and the scandal shocked the nation. The fallout led to the Kugan Law, designed to protect child actors' earnings going forward. But for Jackie, it was too late. He had to rebuild his career from scratch, eventually finding modest success as Uncle Fester in The Addams Family. But the scars ran deep. His childhood had been sold to the highest bidder, and all he got in return was a courtroom lesson in betrayal. Jackie Kugan was the warning, proof that in Hollywood, even innocence could be monetized, and love could be conditional on the paycheck. Shirley Temple. She was the most famous child in the world, a living doll with golden ringlets and dimples that could melt the iciest heart. But behind Shirley Temple's magical smile was a life shaped by relentless control, exhaustion, and subtle exploitation. At just 3 years old, she was dancing for cameras, and by 6, she was 20th Century Fox's biggest moneymaker during the Great Depression. Her childhood was a tightly managed production. Studio heads dictated everything, from her curls to her co-stars. Her days were spent filming, performing, and smiling on cue, with little time for school or rest. Any hint of rebellion was squashed. She belonged to the public now. Off camera, the exploitation didn't stop. She later revealed disturbing behind-the-scenes encounters, including inappropriate advances from adult men in positions of power. Her mother, her closest guardian, was also her unofficial manager, caught between protecting her child and protecting the studio's golden goose. Though she eventually left acting and built a respectable career in diplomacy, Shirley later admitted she never had a true childhood. The world loved her, but no one stopped to ask what she needed. Shirley Temple wasn't just America's sweetheart. She was America's most precious commodity. And like all commodities, she was used until she was no longer profitable. Mickey Rooney. Few actors ever embodied old Hollywood longevity like Mickey Rooney. But his story wasn't just one of survival. It was one of early exploitation, masked as opportunity. Born Joseph Yule Jr., he was thrust into vaudeville by his parents before he could walk. By age 6, he was already under contract with a studio. Rooney became MGM's golden boy through the Andy Hardy series, a franchise that sold the illusion of clean-cut Americana. Behind the scenes, however, the boy working non-stop was also MGM's puppet. Studio heads controlled his public relationships, orchestrating dates with co-stars for headlines, even as he was spiraling privately. Rooney was given little time to rest, study, or simply be a teenager. His workday often exceeded 12 hours, leaving him emotionally depleted and ill-prepared for adult life. MGM gave him fame, but little financial guidance. As an adult, he faced bankruptcies, broken marriages, and deep regret. Later in life, Rooney spoke out about the exploitation he endured, even testifying before Congress about elder abuse, when he was again taken advantage of, this time by his own family. His legacy is bittersweet. A man who gave everything to Hollywood, only to be chewed up and left scraping for dignity. Margaret OBrien. Margaret OBrien wasn't just a child actress. She was MGM's secret weapon for emotional punch. Her tear-streaked performance in Meet Me in St. Louis left audiences brit. Baby Peggy. She was a silent film sensation before she could even form full sentences. Born Peggy Jean Montgomery, Baby Peggy became a millionaire toddler, earning up to $1.5 million a year in the 1920s. She made over 150 shorts and feature films by the age of 7. But while the cameras rolled and her name sold merchandise nationwide, her real life was anything but charmed. Behind her dimpled smile was brutal overwork. She performed dangerous stunts without doubles, once nearly drowning during a shoot. There were no child labor laws to protect her, and she worked 6-day weeks, often in punishing conditions. Her father, a former cowboy, managed her career like a business, pocketing her earnings and giving her none. By the time she turned 8, her career was over, blacklisted after her father demanded more creative control. The fortune she earned had been squandered. She never saw a dime. As an adult, she rebuilt herself under her birth name, becoming a respected author and historian. But the trauma of losing both her childhood and her fortune never faded. In her memoir, she said, "I stopped being a child when I was 18 months old." Baby Peggy's story isn't just one of early stardom. It's one of silent suffering. Natalie Wood. To the world, Natalie Wood was the girl next door with a star's glow. Miracle on 34th Street's sweetheart. Later, the sensual Maria in West Side Story. But behind that camera-ready charm was a life meticulously orchestrated by studios, and a domineering stage mother who pushed her from toddlerhood into roles far beyond her years. By the age of 5, Natalie was acting in major films. Her mother, Maria, would reportedly provoke her to cry on cue by whispering disturbing things like, "Your dog has died," right before a take. Paramount and Warner Brothers saw gold in her innocent look and hurried her from one emotionally draining role to the next, with little regard for her well-being. As she transitioned into adolescence, the roles grew darker, more sexualized, rebel without a cause, splendor in the grass, with little pause for real-life growth. She was manipulated into press romance arrangements and suffered behind the scenes from emotional turmoil and rumored on-set abuse. Even her later marriages and tragic death carried the shadow of a woman who was never truly in control of her image. Natalie Wood wasn't just performing on screen. She was performing off it too, in a world that sold her image and silenced her truth. Elizabeth Taylor grew up on camera, but her childhood was stolen in the process. Linda Darnell. Linda Darnell wasn't a child when she entered Hollywood, but she was close. At 14, she lied and said she was 16 just to land a contract. Studios didn't ask too many questions. They only saw a breathtaking face and dollar signs. What followed was a carefully controlled grooming process that shaped her into a sultry screen siren long before she fully understood what that meant. 20th Century Fox forced her into romantic leads opposite men twice her age while still in her teens. She was discouraged from dating her peers or expressing opinions that might tarnish her mystique. Studio executives monitored her weight, appearance, and even her personal relationships, going so far as to break up real romances if they didn't suit her public image. Off-screen, she faced persistent sexual harassment from industry power players. At 17, she was coerced into a marriage with her much older manager, who exerted total control over her career. The trauma of growing up as a commodity left her emotionally fractured. Though she fought for independence and delivered critically acclaimed performances, Darnell's early manipulation never truly left her. Her tragic death in a fire at age 41 added a haunting final note to a life lived for others. Hollywood made her, but it also consumed her. Deanna Durban. Deanna Durban was Universal's golden ticket during the Depression, a girl with a pure soprano voice and infectious optimism. By age 14, she saved the studio from bankruptcy with a string of musical hits. But success came at a steep price. Her life became a tightly scheduled production line of rehearsals, interviews, and performances. Universal packaged her as the wholesome antidote to rising social anxieties. She was never allowed to age naturally on screen. As she matured, she begged for serious, grown-up roles. But the studio insisted she remain eternally 16, forced into scripts with recycled innocence and wide-eyed smiles, even as she turned 20. Frustrated and artistically stifled, Durban eventually walked away from Hollywood entirely. She moved to France, refused interviews, and never acted again. Her silence became a statement, one of quiet rebellion against a system that profited off her youth, but refused to respect her adulthood. Deanna Durban was proof that sometimes the most devastating exploitation isn't loud. It's the quiet, unyielding refusal to let a child become a person. Bonita Granville. She was Nancy Drew before sleuths were cool, an intelligent, determined girl solving mysteries on the big screen. Bonita Granville captivated audiences with her quick wit and charm, but behind her spunky persona was a teenager trapped in a golden cage. Signed at 9 and Oscar-nominated at just 14, Bonita was Hollywood's go-to girl for tough cookie roles in the late 1930s. What the public didn't see was the immense pressure behind her polished performances. Studios marketed her as a maturing child genius, funneling her into an endless rotation of roles with little say in the matter. Her parents, seeing fame as a fast track to success, did little to intervene. She was expected to work like an adult, act like a child, and never question the script. By the time she reached adulthood, her star began to fade. Typecasting had cornered her career, and she found herself discarded by a system that had wrung out her youth. Though she later found stability as a producer and philanthropist, Granville rarely discussed the toll early fame took on her identity. Bonita Granville didn't just play a girl who solved mysteries, she lived inside one. How could someone so celebrated feel so powerless behind the scenes? Freddy Bartholomew. When British-born Freddy Bartholomew arrived in Hollywood in the 1930s, he became an overnight sensation with films like David Copperfield and Little Lord Fauntleroy. Studios adored his aristocratic charm and refined diction. But off-screen, his life was a Dickensian drama of its own, marked by custody battles, financial greed, and burnout. His aunt had raised him in England and brought him to America for fame, but once success came, so did his estranged parents. They didn't want reconciliation. They wanted a cut of his earnings. What followed was a brutal legal battle that left Freddy emotionally torn and financially drained. At just 12 years old, he had to testify in court about who truly cared for him. Meanwhile, MGM continued to exploit his innocent image, pushing him into role after role without respite. As he aged, he struggled to transition into adult parts, and his career quickly declined. His once stellar fame evaporated almost overnight. Freddy later reinvented himself in television production, far away from the spotlight. But the early betrayal by his own family and the suffocating expectations of a studio system that saw him as a British novelty left permanent scars. Freddy Bartholomew's life mirrored the orphan characters he played, used, abandoned, and forced to grow up far too soon. Jane Withers. Billed as the anti-Shirley Temple, Jane Withers exploded onto the scene as the sassy, mischievous child foil to Temple's innocence. Studios marketed her as the more realistic American girl, funny, feisty, and outspoken. But that personality, so beloved on screen, was carefully crafted and managed behind the scenes. Signed at 8, Withers was working non-stop, often 6 days a week, with rigorous demands placed on her performances. Directors expected high energy, flawless takes, and perfect comedic timing, no matter how tired or overwhelmed she felt. Studio heads pressured her to maintain a carefully curated image of cheerful mischief, with no room for personal struggles. Her parents, though less controlling than others, still capitalized on her fame, pushing her into endless promotions and public appearances. She had little time for school, friends, or even rest. By the time she hit her teens, the industry had moved on. Jane was forced to reinvent herself again and again, eventually finding success in commercials and voice work. But she never forgot the pressures of having to be on 24/7. Jane Withers made audiences laugh, but behind the laughter was a girl constantly performing, never allowed to just be herself. Patty Duke. Patty Duke's story is one of the darkest cautionary tales in child stardom. Cast in The Miracle Worker at just 12, she won an Oscar at 16. But what the cameras didn't show was the horrific abuse she endured from her guardians, John and Ethel Ross. They weren't just managers. They were manipulators who robbed her of her identity, money, and sanity. The Rosses changed her name, took control of every decision, and psychologically terrorized her. They kept her isolated, fed her pills to control her moods, and arranged press appearances where she had to pretend everything was fine. She later revealed in her memoir that she was sexually abused, forced to smile through it all. When she won the Academy Award, she didn't even get to enjoy it. Her acceptance speech was ghostwritten, and her emotions stifled by those who saw her as a meal ticket. On The Patty Duke Show, she was made to play two characters, further deepening her internal confusion and identity crisis. Later diagnosed with bipolar disorder, Duke became a powerful advocate for mental health, turning her pain into purpose. But the trauma she endured as a child star was profound. Patty Duke wasn't just exploited, she was stolen from herself. Peggy Ann Garner. When Peggy Ann Garner delivered her haunting performance in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, audiences were transfixed. She captured the pain, resilience, and hope of a young girl with uncanny maturity. But that emotional depth came at a cost, one forced upon her by a controlling mother and an unrelenting studio system. From the beginning, Peggy was a pawn in her mother's dream of fame. Her mother pushed her into acting at a young age and managed every facet of her life: diet, roles, even friendships. Peggy's days were packed with rehearsals and appearances, her emotions harvested like crops for every performance. She was praised for her natural tears, but those tears were often real, fueled by exhaustion, pressure, and longing for a normal childhood. Fox executives adored her, but never allowed her to age gracefully in the public eye. As she entered adolescence, roles dried up, and the studio lost interest. Peggy's later years were marred by personal hardship and fading opportunities. She acted sporadically, but never regained her early success. She died at 52, largely forgotten by the very industry that once celebrated her. Peggy Ann Garner was brilliant, yes, but she was also a child made to carry adult sorrow for Hollywood's gain. Dean Stockwell. Dean Stockwell's career began at age 7, when MGM saw in him the perfect mixture of vulnerability and intellect. With his soulful eyes and quiet demeanor, he was quickly cast in films like Anchors Aweigh and The Boy with Green Hair. But behind the innocent facade was a child crushed under the weight of expectations and emotional manipulation. Stockwell was thrust into complex roles that required deep emotional resonance, often portraying trauma, loss, or philosophical struggle. MGM executives pushed him to deliver adult-level performances without acknowledging the toll it took on his developing psyche. He was separated from his peers, constantly rehearsing or promoting, and denied a real childhood. His parents, aspiring performers themselves, encouraged the work, but couldn't protect him from the studio's grip. As he entered adolescence, he became increasingly resentful of the industry. The pressure to constantly perform, without room to fail or grow, left him emotionally exhausted. Stockwell walked away from acting for a time, only to return years later with a vengeance, reinventing himself in cult classics like Blue Velvet and Quantum Leap. Still, he admitted that the early years haunted him. Dean Stockwell's youthful brilliance wasn't nurtured, it was exploited, and his later success came not because of the system, but in spite of it. Virginia Widler. Virginia Widler was the quick-talking, eye-rolling comedic foil that every MGM film seemed to need. In The Philadelphia Story, she nearly stole the show from Katharine Hepburn. But while the audience laughed, Widler was fighting a losing battle, one not of talent, but timing. She began acting at just 4 years old and became a studio staple by her teens. Yet, even as she delivered standout performances, the studio gave her little support when it came to transition roles. Once she hit puberty, her usefulness to MGM dried up almost instantly. Her mature features and sharp tongue no longer fit the mold of the adorable sidekick. Despite her efforts to reinvent herself, she was quietly dropped from contracts and forgotten, without fanfare or farewell. The Hollywood that had once depended on her comedic timing now had no place for her. At just 17, Virginia Widler retired from acting and faded into private life, never to return to the spotlight. She later died young from a heart condition, her legacy largely buried beneath more famous co-stars. Virginia's story is a bitter reminder. In old Hollywood, a child star's value often expired the moment they started to grow up. Margaret Carrey. You may not recognize Margaret Carrey's name, but you've definitely seen her moves. She was the live-action reference model for Tinker Bell in Disney's Peter Pan, and every flutter, twirl, and flick of the hip that defines the iconic fairy came from her. But for all that, Carrey received no screen credit and little pay. Starting her career in the 1930s as a child dancer and actress, Carrey was often cast in background roles that demanded long hours and little recognition. Her contribution to Peter Pan was monumental, spending months pantomiming entire sequences on an empty soundstage while animators traced her every move. But because she didn't voice the character or appear on screen, Disney considered her non-essential. She was paid a modest wage and sent on her way. No royalties, no acknowledgement, no seat at the table of animation legends. Like many young talents of her time, Carrey's physical work was consumed by a system that cared more about the product than the person behind it. In later years, she became a beloved figure at fan conventions, finally receiving some overdue appreciation. But the reality lingered. She helped bring magic to life, and Hollywood never even said thank you. Daryl Hickman. Daryl Hickman wasn't just a background player. He was a reliable young lead in the 1940s and early 50s, appearing in films like The Grapes of Wrath and The Human Comedy. But beneath his poised on-screen presence was a child actor quietly unraveling under relentless emotional pressure. Hickman later described the studio system as a machine designed to break children down. He was required to emote pain, joy, loss, and love, before he even understood what those feelings meant. Directors used real emotional manipulation to trigger reactions, and Hickman, desperate to please, gave them what they wanted. He later revealed how alienated he felt, surrounded by adults who saw him as a tool, not a child. Despite a steady paycheck and public recognition, he struggled internally with identity and mental health. When he tried to transition into adult roles, the industry moved on. As an adult, Hickman found peace in writing and spiritual study, but never forgot the damage done during those early years. He described his childhood as professional, but not personal. Daryl Hickman wasn't just exploited for his talent. He was emotionally harvested by a system that valued performance over personhood. Anne Shirley. Anne Shirley's life began with a lie, not hers, but one written into her contract. Born Dawn Eveline Paris, she was renamed by RKO after playing the lead in Anne of Green Gables. The name change wasn't optional. It was branding. From that point on, her personal identity was replaced by a fictional character. At 16, she was suddenly expected to live as Anne Shirley, on screen and off. The studio wanted a wholesome image, so she had to play roles that aligned with their fantasy, even if it meant denying her own growth, maturity, and feelings. She was typecast into innocent, docile girl-next-door roles, despite craving complexity. Her fame surged, but internally, she struggled. The longer she stayed under contract, the more distant her true self became. In interviews, she was told what to say. In public, she had to smile on cue. Her real life was hidden under a layer of performance. Anne eventually walked away from acting at just 26, choosing a quieter life away from Hollywood. But the residue of being renamed, repackaged, and reshaped left an imprint that never fully faded. Anne Shirley didn't just play a fictional character. She was forced to become one. Bob's Watson. Bob's Watson was the go-to child for heartbreaking death scenes in the 1930s Hollywood. In films like On Borrowed Time and Boys Town, he moved audiences to tears with his sincerity and raw emotion. But what no one realized was that those tears weren't always acting. Sometimes, they were pulled from real fear, grief, and psychological exhaustion. The youngest of 9 siblings in a performing family, Bob's was pushed into acting by economic need. His ability to cry on cue made him a studio favorite, but also led to emotional manipulation. Directors would isolate him, scare him, or even talk about death to trigger the perfect sob. He didn't understand why his sadness made people clap. He later recalled being confused, even hurt, by how his vulnerability was used for entertainment. While other kids were riding bikes and playing baseball, Bob's was memorizing lines and rehearsing hospital deathbed scenes. After leaving the business, he found a more meaningful path, becoming a Methodist minister. Yet even as he counseled others, the trauma of being Hollywood's little mourner lingered. Bob's Watson gave Hollywood everything, including his innocence. And while his performances brought empathy to audiences, they also revealed just how far studios would go to mine a child's soul for the perfect shot. Gloria Jean. Gloria Jean was Universal's answer to Deanna Durban, a bright-eyed soprano with a smile as big as her voice. At just 13, she was headlining musical comedies and charming wartime audiences. But her rapid rise was fueled more by studio desperation than care. Universal needed a young star to keep pace with rival studios, and Gloria fit the mold perfectly. She sang beautifully, danced skillfully, and never complained, making her a dream for producers. But behind her composure, Gloria was overwhelmed. Her education was patchy, her schedule grueling, and her contracts binding. The studio worked her like an adult, but protected her like a prop, rarely offering mentorship or financial guidance. As the musical trend faded in the late 1940s, so did Gloria's roles. She tried transitioning into drama, but was denied serious opportunities. By her early 20s, her career was essentially over. without savings, support, or fallback options. She spent decades working outside the industry, her fame fading into obscurity. In later interviews, Gloria maintained her grace, but her eyes often hinted at the heartbreak of having been abandoned by the very machine she once kept alive. Gloria Jean was a bright star, burned too fast by the studio system's need for the next big thing. Scotty Beckett. Scotty Beckett was once the cherubic star of our gang, a precocious little boy with dimples and a lisp that melted hearts. By the time he was 10, he had acted alongside Shirley Temple and even played young versions of characters portrayed by Cary Grant. But behind his sweet screen persona lay a tragic trajectory, fueled by exploitation and the brutal realities of Hollywood childhood fame. Scotty's parents and studio handlers saw him as a golden ticket, funneling him from one film to another with barely a break. His success came quickly and forcefully, but there was no roadmap for how to cope with such fame, or what to do when it faded. As he aged, the roles dried up. He struggled with identity, addiction, and a series of failed comebacks. The industry that once courted him now ignored him. By his 30s, Scotty had a criminal record, multiple stints in rehab, and a string of broken relationships. In 1968, at just 38 years old, Scotty was found dead in a motel room, suspected overdose, possible suicide. The boy who once made America laugh died alone, forgotten, and shattered. Scotty Beckett's story isn't just tragic. It's a warning about what happens when a child is turned into a product, then discarded. These child stars lit up the silver screen, but behind the scenes, many were used, broken, and discarded. Their stories remind us that fame has a cost, and innocence is too high a price. Like, comment, and subscribe for more forgotten Hollywood truths. Let's keep their stories alive.